It was a calm morning in Oakwood Estates. The streets were quiet, birds sang from the trees, and neighbours carried on with their usual routines. Some watered their lawns, others walked their dogs, and kids played on their bikes. Everything felt ordinary, until the notices appeared. Taped to every front door was a letter from the HOA. The bold headline read, "Mandatory rule, effective immediately." Homeowners stopped in their tracks. Mothers stood frozen on porches, fathers stepped back from their morning coffee, and children whispered as their parents read the words aloud. No one had seen this coming. The notice demanded something strange, something none of them had ever agreed to. Confusion spread like a shadow over the neighborhood. Some neighbors thought it had to be a mistake. Others felt a cold knot of anger twisting in their stomachs. The HOA had always been strict, but this was different. This was a rule no one had heard of. No one had voted on, and yet it was written as if it had already been decided. Questions buzzed from house to house. Who made this rule? When did this happen? Why weren't we told? People stepped into the streets, holding the notices in their hands, searching each other's faces for answers. But there were none. At the end of the block, Mrs. Thompson shook her head in disbelief. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered. Her neighbor, Mr. Carter, clenched his fists. "They can't do this. They just can't." By the afternoon, small groups had gathered on corners, whispering about the sudden demand. The once friendly streets now carried a heavy air of suspicion. Every word felt sharp. Every glance carried doubt. The community had always trusted their HOA to make fair choices, but now that trust was cracking. When evening came, the HOA president held a rushed meeting in the clubhouse. The room filled quickly. People waved the notices in. The air, voices rising with frustration. "Who approved this?" someone shouted. "We never voted," cried another. The president, calm but firm, simply said, "This rule was passed by the board. It is mandatory. No exceptions." The words sent a shock through the room. Whispers turned into arguments. Neighbors who had been friends for years now stood on opposite sides, debating whether to obey or resist. And yet, deep down, almost everyone felt the same thing. Something wasn't right. Why was the HOA pushing this so hard? Why now? And why in secret? Rumors began to spread. Rumors that the president had a hidden reason. Some whispered about money, others about power. Nobody knew for sure, but everyone felt the same growing unease. The neighborhood, once peaceful, was now restless. The notices still hung on doors like warnings, and the rule, whatever its purpose, was now the talk of every dinner table, every phone call, every late-night porch conversation. What started as a single sheet of paper was turning into something far bigger, something dangerous. And the biggest question of all lingered in the air, like a storm about to break. Why would the HOA enforce a rule no one agreed on, and how far would the neighbors go to fight back? The sun had barely risen when the strange rule shook Oakwood Estates. Each door carried the same cold notice, and for the first time, the community felt divided. The rule was simple on paper, but heavy in meaning. All front doors must be painted grey within 30 days. Non-compliance will result in fines. At first, many thought it was a joke. Grey? Why grey? Some families had spent hundreds of dollars making their homes warm and colourful. Red doors, blue doors, even a cheerful yellow. To demand every house look the same felt cruel, like stripping away each family's voice. By mid-morning, the sidewalks buzzed with conversations. Parents pointed at their doors, shaking their heads. Children listened wide-eyed as their mothers and fathers argued about what this meant. The sound of neighbors calling across lawns carried an uneasy energy. Mr. Lopez, who had painted his door deep red just last year, stood in disbelief. "I put my time and savings into this, and now they want me to cover it with grey," he said, his voice heavy with anger. Across the street, Mrs. Patel clutched the notice with trembling hands. "But when did we vote for this? Did I miss a meeting?" she asked softly, almost to herself. No one had an answer. The more people talked, the clearer it became. There had been no discussion, no warning, no choice. The HOA had acted alone. By noon, the tension grew stronger. Small groups gathered in driveways, comparing their letters, searching for loopholes. But each notice was identical, stamped with the HOA seal and signed by the president himself. Some residents muttered that it was just paint and not worth the fight. Others disagreed, saying it wasn't about paint at all. It was about control. If the HOA could decide the colour of their doors without a vote, what else could they do? The calm neighbourhood of Oakwood Estates was no longer calm. The rule had arrived, and with it came a storm that no one was ready for. By the next morning, Oakwood Estates was no longer the same quiet neighbourhood it had been just days before. The strange grey door rule had spread from porch to porch like wildfire, and now every corner of the community buzzed with questions. Neighbours gathered in small clusters on sidewalks, clutching the notices in their hands. Some waved them angrily, others stared at them in disbelief. For many, it still didn't feel real. Mrs. Thompson, who had lived in the neighbourhood for 20 years, spoke with a trembling voice. "We never voted for this. Not once. How can they just decide something like this without asking us?" Her neighbour, Mr. Carter, snapped back, "Because they think they can do whatever they want. That's why." His voice was sharp, but his eyes showed the same unease everyone felt. At the park, a group of families argued over whether to follow the new rule. One man said it was easier to paint than to fight. "It's just a door," he shrugged. But a young mother quickly cut in. "No, it's more than that. If they can take this decision without us, what's next? Our fences, our roofs, our yards." The fear behind her words made others nod. Later that day, the HOA called for an emergency community meeting in the clubhouse. The room filled to the brim. Neighbours packed shoulder to shoulder, holding their notices, waiting for answers. The air was thick, heavy with tension. When the HOA president walked in, the room went silent. He cleared his throat and said, "This rule is final. It has already been approved by the board. Every resident must comply." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Hands shot up, voices grew louder. "Who voted on this?" shouted one man. "We didn't," cried another. The president didn't flinch. He repeated the same cold line. "This is a board decision. It is mandatory." That was the breaking point. The room erupted. Some shouted in anger, others demanded proof, while a few stormed out in frustration. The once trusting community now saw the board in a new light, not as leaders, but as rulers forcing their will. By the time the meeting ended, no one felt reassured. If anything, the anger had only grown. Neighbours who once smiled at each other now spoke in hushed, tense voices. The divide was clear: comply or resist. And in the middle of it all, one thought kept echoing in everyone's mind. Why was the HOA so desperate to push this rule through, and what were they hiding? The grey door rule was meant to bring order to Oakwood Estates, or at least that's what the HOA president claimed, but instead of unity, it sparked rebellion. At first, neighbours had been confused, but as the days passed, confusion hardened into anger. People who rarely spoke to each other now stood side by side, shaking their heads at the notices taped to their doors. The once friendly community had become a place of sharp voices and watchful eyes. Mr. Lopez, the man with the bold red door, was the first to speak out loudly. Standing on his porch, he raised the letter in the air for anyone walking by to see. "This is not legal," he said firmly. I just painted this door last year with my own money. They can't force me to change it just because they want everything grey. This is not their house. It's mine." His defiance was contagious. Soon, others followed. Mrs. Patel, usually quiet and reserved, made her voice heard. "I refuse," she said, clutching her notice with trembling hands. "If they can do this without our approval, then what stops them from changing our yards, our fences, our very homes? This is not just about paint. This is about control." The small sparks of resistance grew into something larger. Groups of homeowners began to gather, not at the clubhouse where the HOA ruled, but in living rooms and backyards, away from watchful eyes. They whispered strategies, shared phone numbers of local attorneys, and promised each other that they would not give in easily. But the HOA was quick to strike back. Within days, new letters arrived in every mailbox. These were not polite notices but harsh warnings, each one printed in bold red ink. Failure to comply will result in a $50 fine for each day past the deadline. Legal action may be taken if violations continue. The threat shook many families. Parents whispered at dinner tables, their voices hushed, so their children wouldn't hear the fear in their words. Some worried they would not be able to afford the daily fines. Others wondered if legal trouble could truly come from something as small as a painted door. For some, fear won. A few neighbours quietly bought buckets of grey paint, hoping to avoid the fight altogether. But for others, the threat only made them stronger. "This isn't about doors anymore," Mrs. Thompson said at one gathering. Her grey hair shimmered in the lamplight as she spoke with fire in her eyes. "It's about power. If we let them bully us into this, they will do it again and again. Today it's paint. Tomorrow it could be anything. We must take a stand now." Her words spread quickly. They were repeated on porches, at fences, even whispered by children who overheard their parents late at night. The message was clear. Resistance was no longer about colour. It was about freedom. But as the neighbourhood divided between those who obeyed and those who refused, a deeper question began to surface. Why was the HOA pushing this so hard? Why did the president insist on such a pointless, unpopular rule? Whispers began to swirl. Some claimed the president had personal ties to a local paint company. Others believed it was about money, contracts, profits, kickbacks hidden in plain sight. Nobody knew for sure, but everyone could feel it. Something was wrong. Something bigger was hiding beneath the grey paint. The neighbourhood was no longer just a collection of homes. It had become a battlefield. And though the resistance was growing stronger every day, so too was the mystery behind the rule that had started it all. The resistance in Oakwood Estates was no longer just a murmur. It had become a force. Neighbours who once only waved politely now stood together in groups, trading whispers and planning their next move. They had agreed on one thing. The grey door rule was not about community appearance. It was about something deeper, something hidden, and they were determined to uncover it. The first clue came from Mrs. Patel's teenage son, who overheard his mother on a call with a neighbour. "They say the HOA president has family in the paint business," she whispered, her voice low and tense. At first it sounded like a rumour too wild to be true, but then other whispers began to confirm it. Mr. Carter, who worked downtown, claimed he had seen the HOA president's brother-in-law managing a local hardware store, one that just happened to be running a major sale on the exact shade of grey the HOA had demanded. Another neighbour swore she had spotted a delivery truck unloading cans of the same paint near the president's garage. The more they dug, the more suspicious it became. The rule wasn't about uniformity or community pride, as the president had claimed at the meeting. It was about profit, a secret deal perhaps, a way to funnel money from every household into the hands of the president's own family. The anger grew sharper. People who had once been nervous about speaking out now felt a fire burning inside them. "We are not pawns," Mr. Lopez declared, slamming his fist on his kitchen table during a late-night gathering. "If this is about lining their pockets, we will not stand for it." Meanwhile, the HOA board grew quieter. They no longer sent long letters, only curt warnings. Their silence only made the rumors stronger. What were they hiding? Why wouldn't they explain how the rule was passed? The turning point came when Mrs. Thompson's grandson, curious and bold, found something unusual online. Digging through local records, he uncovered a recently filed contract between the HOA and a small paint supplier. The supplier's name? A company owned by none other than the president's brother-in-law. The discovery sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Proof, real proof, that the HOA president had been pushing the grey door rule for personal gain. The news spread like wildfire. Neighbors passed the information in hushed voices at first, then louder, until it became the talk of every porch and driveway. Even those who had already painted their doors grey felt betrayed. "We trusted them," one woman said bitterly, staring at her newly coated door, "and they sold us out for money." But proof was not enough. The residents wanted answers face to face. They wanted the president to stand before them and explain why he had used his power to turn their homes into his family's profit. So they prepared for the next HOA meeting. This time, it would not be a polite gathering with calm questions. This time, it would be a confrontation. The community was ready, united by anger, suspicion, and the truth they had uncovered. And though the president still sat in his position of power, his silence had already betrayed him. Oakwood Estates was no longer just resisting, it was preparing for a fight. And in the back of every resident's mind, one chilling thought lingered. If the president was willing to cheat them over something as small as paint, what else had he been hiding all along? The night of the HOA meeting felt heavier than any before. For years, gatherings in the Oakwood clubhouse had been routine. Neighbors sitting quietly in folding chairs while the board read updates about lawn care, parking spaces, and dues. But this time, there was no quiet. This time, the room pulsed with tension. Every chair was filled, and people stood pressed against the walls, holding copies of the notice in one hand and whispers of the president's hidden deal in the other. The air buzzed with low voices, sharp glances, and the heavy thud of shoes tapping impatiently against the floor. At the front of the room sat the HOA board, stiff and silent behind their long wooden table. And in the center, wearing his usual calm expression, was the president. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted nervously across the crowd, as if he already knew what was coming. The meeting began with the usual announcements, but no one was listening. Murmurs grew louder until finally Mrs. Thompson rose to her feet. Her voice, though aged, carried power that cut through the noise. "We want answers," she demanded. "Why was this rule passed without a vote? And why is your brother-in-law's company supplying the paint?" The room exploded in gasps and shouts. Some neighbors clapped, others yelled in agreement. The president stiffened, his jaw tight. "That is not relevant to this discussion," he said firmly. But the crowd was not satisfied. Mr. Lopez stood next. He held up a printout of the contract the grandson had uncovered. "This is proof," he said, his voice steady and loud. "Proof that this so-called rule is nothing more than a money grab. You used your power to line your own family's pockets. That's corruption." The room roared. Shouts echoed from every corner. "Shame! Resign! You betrayed us!" The president banged his gavel, but the sound was drowned out by the fury of the people he had underestimated. For years, the residents of Oakwood had stayed silent, fearful of fines and rules. But now, their fear was gone. Betrayal had lit a fire stronger than any threat of punishment. Even those who had painted their doors grey were shouting, their anger fueled by humiliation at being tricked. The president tried to regain control. He raised his hands, his voice growing louder. "The rule was legal. The board approved it." But his words only fueled the outrage. A woman from the back shouted, "Then show us the vote. Show us the minutes from the meeting." The demand echoed through the crowd. "Show us! Show us!" The board members shifted uncomfortably. Papers shuffled, eyes darted. But no one produced proof. Because there was none, the moment stretched, thick with silence, as neighbours stared at the men and women they had once trusted. It was Mrs. Patel who finally spoke, her voice sharp as steel. "You've lied to us. You've stolen from us. And you think you can still sit there in power?" "Not anymore." The clubhouse shook with applause, stomping feet and voices rising together. This was no longer just a meeting. It was a rebellion. For the first time, the president looked small behind his desk. His calm mask was cracking, and the weight of dozens of furious eyes pressed down on him. The people of Oakwood had reached their breaking point. The rule that was supposed to bring them under control had done the opposite. It had united them, fueled them, and given them the courage to challenge the very people who once ruled them in silence. The confrontation had begun, and after this night, nothing in Oakwood Estates would ever be the same. The night after the explosive meeting, Oakwood Estates no longer felt like the quiet, uniform neighborhood it had once been. Something had shifted. The people were no longer whispering behind closed doors. They were speaking openly, boldly, and with one voice. The confrontation with the HOA president had lit a spark, and that spark quickly turned into a fire. The next morning, signs began to appear on porches and windows. Some read, "No more corruption." Others shouted, "Our homes, our choice." It was clear. The residents were done being silent. Small gatherings popped up on lawns and driveways. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now stood united, drafting petitions and trading information about local lawyers. Copies of the contract linking the president's brother-in-law to the paint deal were passed from hand to hand like weapons in a battle for truth. One homeowner, a retired teacher named Mr. Jenkins, took it upon himself to organize the effort. Standing on his porch, he told the crowd, "They've taken advantage of us for too long. This time we fight back, with proof, with unity, and with the law on our side." His words were met with cheers. Soon after, a formal petition began to circulate. It demanded two things: the immediate cancellation of the grey door rule and the resignation of the HOA president. Within days, nearly every household had signed it. Even those who had reluctantly painted their doors grey now wanted justice. The pressure mounted. Local news stations picked up the story after a resident tipped them off. Cameras rolled as neighbors stood proudly in front of their colorful doors, explaining how their HOA had tricked them into buying paint from a relative of the president. Reporters called it the grey door scandal. The exposure embarrassed the board, but they dug their heels in deeper. Letters from the HOA became even harsher. Threats of LA, suites, property liens, and higher fines filled mailboxes. The board wanted to break the community's will before things got out of hand. But it was already too late. The backlash had grown too strong. Families who once avoided conflict now stood tall, refusing to be bullied. Residents pooled money to hire a lawyer who specialized in HOA abuse cases. The lawyer, after reviewing the contract, declared that the board's actions were a clear abuse of power and promised to take the case to court if necessary. The president tried to save face. He called another emergency meeting hoping to calm the storm. But this time the room was different. Instead of fear and silence, there was defiance. Neighbors came armed with petitions, contracts, and even reporters waiting outside. Every attempt he made to explain away the rule was drowned out by the voices of the very people he claimed to represent. By now, even some of the board members had grown uneasy. They shifted in their seats, unable to meet the eyes of the crowd. They had followed the president's lead out of loyalty or fear. But now, with the truth spreading beyond the neighborhood, their positions felt fragile. The backlash was complete. What began as a single unfair rule had turned into a full-blown revolt. The president and his allies were trapped, caught between their greed and the fury of the people they had underestimated. Oakwood Estates was no longer just resisting. It was fighting back with everything it had: signatures, lawyers, the press, and most importantly, unity. And as the sun set on the neighborhood that evening, a feeling of power hummed through the streets. For the first time, the residents realized something they had never dared believe before. They didn't need to fear the HOA. The HOA should fear them. The storm that had begun with a single notice on a front door now reached its breaking point. Oakwood Estates was no longer a quiet neighborhood of trimmed lawns and polite smiles. It was a community united, standing firm against the very board that had ruled them for years. And at the center of it all stood the HOA president, the man who thought no one would dare challenge him. The petition had already gained more signatures than anyone imagined. The lawyer had prepared the paperwork for legal action, and the news coverage, the grey door scandal, as the reporters called it, had embarrassed the board in front of the entire town. The pressure was unbearable. When the next HOA meeting began, the clubhouse looked more like a courtroom than a community hall. Neighbors filled every seat, reporters waited outside, and the board sat stiffly at their table. This time, there were no long introductions, no small talk about dues or landscaping. The residents had one demand: answers. Mr. Lopez spoke first, holding the contract high for everyone to see. "We know the truth. You made us buy paint from your own family. You abused your power. And you lied to us." His voice rang through the room, echoed by nods and murmurs of agreement. Mrs. Thompson, who had once feared speaking up, stood next. Her voice was steady and strong. "We trusted you to lead this neighborhood. Instead, you betrayed us. That is something we will never forget, and something we will not forgive." The president tried to respond, but his words were drowned out by shouts. "Resign! Resign!" the crowd roared. Some banged their fists on chairs, others stomped their feet. Even a few board members avoided his gaze, ashamed of the role they had played. Under the weight of the fury, the president finally cracked. He rose, his face pale, and muttered something about miscommunication and good intentions. But the people were not fooled. They pressed harder, refusing to let him escape the truth. Finally, with no way out, he slumped back into his chair and whispered the words the community had been waiting to hear. "I resign." The room erupted. Cheers filled the air, and neighbors hugged one another in relief. The rule was thrown out immediately, the contract cancelled, and the fines wiped away. For the first time in weeks, Oakwood Estates felt light again, free from the shadow that had loomed over it. But the victory came with lessons burned deep into the hearts of the residents. They now understood the power of unity, the strength of standing together, and the danger of giving blind trust to those in charge. The HOA had always acted like an untouchable authority, but in the end, it was the community that held the true power. As neighbors walked home from the meeting, the streets buzzed with excitement. Some laughed, some cried, and others simply stood outside, breathing in the cool night air with a sense of triumph. Doors of every color, red, blue, yellow, and green, stood proudly in the fading light, a symbol of individuality and freedom. The HOA had paid the price for its greed. The president's reputation was ruined, his allies scattered, and the community stronger than ever. Oakwood Estates would never forget the grey door rule, but they would also never forget how they had fought back and won. And as silence slowly returned to the neighborhood, one truth remained clear. When an HOA enforces a rule no one agreed on, the cost isn't just fines or paint. The cost can be their own downfall.